Hi everyone. So for my presentation, I will be talking about the Minneapolis Public School District and their policy to terminate the police contract as well as implement restorative discipline approaches in public schools. And this policy was implemented to combat the school to prison pipeline. And just for some background information on the school to prison pipeline, it involves a series of practices, policies, beliefs that funnel our nation's children from the classroom into the juvenile and criminal justice systems. And scholars have found that the at-risk children in particular, who are most vulnerable to falling into this pipeline are students of color, students with complex trauma histories, students with disabilities, students who are of a low socioeconomic background, don't have access to a high quality education through their public school. So it really affects those children the most. And there are many things that contribute to this pipeline, mainly the zero tolerance policies, which involve exclusionary discipline policies such as expulsion, suspension, anything that removes a child out of the learning environment for disciplinary sake, a lack of an emotional support and intervention opportunity at school, implicit biases, exposure to violence, racial profiling, and excessive policing as well. And this really just overall reflects our nation's value of incarceration over education and rehabilitation, as this is even seen with children as young as school age. So I felt that that was important to bring up as well. There's also a racial disparity as Black students are overrepresented in this as well. So the data shows that Black students in Minnesota, but this is across the board as well, are considerably more likely to be expelled, suspended, or brought to law enforcement for the same violation that may result in a warning or just a simple conversation for a white student at the same school. And a similar study shows that in the 2025 to 2026 school year, 46% of Black students had more than one out of school suspension, compared to 26% of white students, reflecting this disparity as well. And finally, you can't talk about the school to prison pipeline without policing. And school police became very prominent in schools beginning in the 90s. And it was found that schools with a predominantly Black or Hispanic population had more of a police presence than schools with a predominantly white student population. And police presence ultimately results in just the criminalization of student behavior, resulting in students coming in contact with law enforcement and therefore an increased risk of juvenile crime. So, as I mentioned before, some students are more at risk of falling into this pipeline than other students, and it's largely based on their socioeconomic status. Students who are of a lower socioeconomic status live in low-income neighborhoods, and their access to school might not be as great, where their schools have inadequate resources, uncertified teachers, overcrowded classrooms, and this ultimately results in student disengagement, which causes early dropout, academic withdrawal, and this is part of those institutional systemic factors that lead to poor outcomes for these students. Another factor that shapes the school to prison pipeline was the No Child Left Behind policy established by the Bush administration in 2001. And this policy was really enacted in response to the report A Nation at Risk. And A Nation at Risk really emphasizes the idea that America is falling behind in the education system and new methods must be developed. So this policy was intended to help at-risk students really excel, but it had the opposite effect as this policy raised by the Bush administration now required schools to reach state and federal standards and report their progress to the federal government. And if there was not an improvement in student test scores, it resulted in consequences for the district. And this was really much a punishment-based system where the school would often push out students who weren't meeting the benchmarks set by the government. And they were essentially failing these students. Students who were already struggling were officially struggling because the school ultimately would reject them to preserve their standing with the government. In my paper, I highlight three social policies that were intended to address the pipeline. The first being the Dear Colleague letter from the Department of Education and the Department of Justice, where they call for schools to remove their zero tolerance policies, and they also outline some disciplinary strategies that are proactive and effective. I also touch on the Chicago Public School District and what they had planned for a safety policy which involves eliminating the police from schools and implementing a trauma response training. And then finally, what I will be talking and elaborating more on in this presentation, which is what happened in Minneapolis public schools, where they implement restorative justice and restorative discipline practices and terminate their police contract as well. So the main highlights of this policy was that they reallocate the funds from eliminating the police and put that money into investing in in-school mental health services, counselors, and different social emotional resources. Um, and also suspending the use of exclusionary discipline by implementing more supportive interventions. And this policy was enacted in June 2020. So this policy does have a lot of historical and cultural, political influence as well. It was inspired and really took effect right after the murder of George Floyd in 2020. His murder really raised public attention surrounding police brutality and racial injustice. And Minneapolis is a city where there has been a long-standing history of police presence in schools, as well as police brutality. And there's just disproportionate effects on students of color in particular. You see them coming up in the juvenile criminal system at a disproportional rate as well. And the community really rose after the murder of George Floyd and put pressure um, on the school district to really move away from using police to discipline and instead really invest in counseling. And the Board of Education drafted and presented this resolution, and the school board unanimously voted for the change, and student representatives were also involved in this as well. So this policy is a local policy as it only applies to the public school districts in Minneapolis. And the contract with the police was terminated. And instead of having law enforcement on campus, there are now public safety support specialists, which are not members of law enforcement. They are really just people who are employed to promote public safety at school. And rather than having additional police and everything on campus, the district hired additional counselors and mental health professionals to provide quality mental health programming in schools, which before this was very uncommon in schools in Minneapolis. So having a more robust mental health program was proven to be really effective for students, and I'll touch on that more later in the presentation. And all students enrolled in Minneapolis public schools are affected by this change. Students who enroll in private schools do not experience this change. So there's really four main objectives outlined by the policy. The first being that police at school are eliminated, and this is really intended to reduce the student contact with law enforcement. And second, the policy also aims to prevent criminalizing behaviors at school, and this is mainly done through restorative discipline, meaning that discipline is constructive. Students have the chance to really reflect on their actions and think about how to improve. Students are given time to reconsider their decision. Students are given spaces to really evaluate their behaviors. So it's a more constructive and proactive approach to discipline. Also, the policy eliminates the zero tolerance policies, which focus on punishment. So those zero tolerance policies involve like suspension, expulsion. These policies are not trauma informed, and instead, the district intends to adopt more supportive interventions through having access to mental health services and counseling and other supports as well. And then finally, the policy also aims to educate staff members about racial profiling, racial biases. In terms of the related philosophies and values that shape this policy, there were members of the Minneapolis community that believed that police brutality is a real thing and that there is a lot of associated trauma for especially students of color, and that to make school a safe learning environment, we should really remove police and figure out a different alternative. However, there was another group that believed that strong police support is needed to discipline, to ensure safety. And then prior to this, there had been many discussions of removing in-school police, but really the murder of George Floyd inspired this immediate change. There was another debate on some community members believing in this kind of constructive, restorative philosophy. However, some did continue to believe in this traditional model of discipline. Um, but ultimately, they came to the agreement that community is a significant factor in assisting students who have been victims of perpetuated societal harm, and that really, to reach desired outcomes, the community really needs to explore constructive discipline instead of continuing to use a punishment-based system. And then lastly, the policy really is rooted in anti-racism by addressing systemic biases in discipline that really disproportionately affect students of color. So, in terms of who is included and excluded, this is a local policy that has only taken effect in public schools in Minneapolis. So, therefore, schools in rural communities outside of the city, they are not bound to this policy, and also private schools are not mandated to make a change as well. There was primarily a focus on Minneapolis as there was a lot of activism and pressure coming from community members and students in the city. And there wasn't necessarily the same level of activism from community members in rural and suburban communities outside of the city of Minneapolis. So there are many strengths of the implementation process for the policy. First, the school board unanimously voted for the policy, which made just for an overall smoother implementation process. Also, there was a reported improved school climate, and teachers and students just overall got along better in the classroom, in the school environment. Also, importantly, students of color reported feeling safer at school. They also reported feeling more heard by the administration as well. There was also a reduced disciplinary action count, so there was an overall reduction in expulsions, in fighting, in suspensions, which was great. And then obviously with the removal of law enforcement, there was reduced contact with law enforcement overall, which was great for just not sending students into the juvenile criminal justice system for school-based violations. And then what I found to be really interesting was that in the 2018 to 2019 school year, there were 13,000 disciplinary actions across districts in the city of Minneapolis. However, the year the policy was enacted, so 2020 to 2021, the first half of the school year was reported. And during that first half of the school year, there were only 1,900 disciplinary actions reported. So it just shows that there was a major increase in just pro-social behavior amongst students as a result of the policy, perhaps. And another thing that I wanted to bring to light was that rather than just expelling students for a violation, there would be a family group conference that would be held between family members, the student, and members of school staff, where the student violation would be discussed in lengthy detail. The student would reflect on their behavior, and this was shown to be a really effective approach rather than just kicking a student out who may need just some additional supports. And trainings were also administered to staff. So, some trainings included just teaching impact of behavior, strengthening ties between teachers and students. Um, and what I think is really great, um, especially a great part of the policy, was redirecting funds from school-based policing, and just reallocating this and putting this into school-based counseling services and allowed for just a growth in the mental health programming overall. Students reported just not having to deal with long wait times, which resulted in students actually utilizing their services. And this is great for just eliminating the gap in access to therapy in general. Students who come from higher income backgrounds have just a more privileged and easy access to therapists and just services in general. So having these school-based services available and available readily definitely eliminates this gap for students who may be struggling in terms of their family's income. And in reflecting on challenges of this implementation process, the racial disparities in school discipline do remain despite the efforts of this policy. So, while Black students comprise of roughly a third of the student body, 70% of disciplinary actions involves these students, which is very upsetting. It does show that Black students are overrepresented in this statistic. Perhaps there is a training issue with staff where staff needs to be trained more on racial profiling and racial biases in reporting student violations. So that is something to consider for future research as well. Um, what I found interesting too was there was also a reported increase in disruptive behavior in class. I thought this might be pandemic related, perhaps. It was during the 2020 to 2021 school year. I don't know if this was Zoom education at the time for them. So I found this to be interesting, the statistic. And lastly, some sources did report that some teachers reported a reluctance to adapt new strategies. Um, and these strategies involve the restorative strategies, more constructive behavior, or disciplinary approaches. Some teachers were very set on that traditional model of discipline, punishment, rather than um, constructive conversation. And then lastly, there are many implications for practice, policy, and research. So to begin with research, continued longitudinal research is needed just to really follow the effects of eliminating school-based police and improving and bolstering um, in-school counseling services, just to kind of see how that plays out over the next few years. And more research also needs to be done on this existing racial disparity that is still seen. And perhaps more research should be done to develop effective trainings to target staff racial biases in reporting student violations. I think that is an important point as well. In terms of policy, more anti-racist policies need to be developed in schools. This should not only be the case in the state of Minnesota, this should be the case across states, and really just making sure schools have policies to investigate an instance of a student violation rather than just resulting to expulsion or suspension and these zero tolerance policies. Really just taking a situation and investigating it with a student and examining it in using a constructive lens and having student reflect on their behavior, I think is essential, especially during this phase in their development. And then finally, practice. Schools need to have programming to allow for these more restorative disciplinary actions. So, implementing this across schools, making sure that students have access to these types of interventions where they get to reflect on their behavior, and also making sure that schools also have meditation groups, counseling groups, just having a robust counseling service center and mental health programming. And this can be done through just hiring more mental health professionals in schools and, um, making sure that money is invested in that because this ultimately improves student well-being and also student outcomes as well. And then here are my references. Thank you to those who watched my presentation. It was very interesting to do all this research and I really enjoyed it. I hope you all enjoy your holiday break and yes, enjoy. Thank you very much.